Hello, welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society. I'm your host, Cory Massimino, and today I'm pleased to say I'm joined by good friend, Jason Lee Byas. Jason's a fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society and a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Michigan. His academic work focuses on punishment and its alternatives, rights theory, and justice beyond the state. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Glad to be back.
I know you've been on the show before with one of our other hosts, Zach Woodman, back in the day. So that was a great episode if people want to go check that out. Glad to have you on to talk about new topics. I kind of wanted to poke your brain about some of the work that you've been recently doing, either stuff that I've seen has been published the last couple of years or stuff that'll be published soon, I guess, that I've had the pleasure to read beforehand. And so there's a couple topics that you've been working on. And so the first thing I wanted to ask you about deals with a paper you wrote on public choice. So I thought, could you tell our audience, in your words, what is public choice and what is its meta problem, as you phrase it?
Yeah, so public choice. So the way I would look at it is public choice is the study of politics and governments and basically a lot of other kinds of non-market decision-making, but especially governments, through the same kind of lens as economics. In other words, thinking about individuals and the incentives that they face, and thus seeing how different institutional arrangements might lead to different incentives, and thus different actions, thus different outcomes. And that's usually that's sometimes part of a larger project we might call Virginia political economy, which connects to constitutional political economy, which is thinking, how can we best design institutions so that we get outcomes that we want, don't get outcomes that we don't want. And it's pretty easy to see why someone who is attracted to public choice as a way of looking at institutions would also be interested in looking at constitutional political economy. But I think there's kind of, because of course, if you see all the problems institutionally in terms of incentives that there are, then you're going to want to try to fix them by changing the incentives, by changing the institutions. But what I was going to say is, I think there's kind of a tension between these two things, namely that to the extent that the public choice diagnoses about all the problems in state-like states and state-like institutions, to the extent that's true, then it will be, to that same extent, harder to adjust the institutional arrangement towards the direction of the recommendations of constitutional political economy. In other words, if public choice is already telling us why things are screwed up, then the fact that they're screwed up in that particular way is itself a reason to think it's especially unlikely to get the fixes that constitutional political economy wants us to get.
Then I'm curious, I guess, what your thoughts are on the limits, other kinds of limits to public choice analysis as well. I mean, incentives matter, incentives are important. What about other things? What about ideology? What about actual sincere, passionate belief in something, regardless of maybe the immediate material incentives? I think a lot of, and this maybe goes to actually someone like Rothbard's problems that he has with what he takes to be the public choice view. There's intentionality behind some of the things that we're talking about. So how do you think that fits into the public choice picture?
Yeah, so, I think I would agree. I would agree. I would also say I don't think that it's a fatal problem for public choice type stuff. So I think it's wrong to see public choice as in like a very mechanical way, where it's like you have these institutions which have these incentives. People will necessarily respond in exactly this way. but it's better to see it as these are incentives and they're kind of like attractors that make things tend in a particular direction, barring, like, all other things being equal, things will go this way. It's kind of like tilting its hand on a scale towards a particular kind of outcome, which doesn't necessarily mean that that's what will necessarily happen, but there's a tendency in that direction. So public choice authors seem to differ between themselves about like how mechanical they are about this. So people like George Stigler, it's going to be a lot more mechanical seeming, but James Buchanan definitely would want to agree with the same points you're saying there on ideology. And in fact, in his attempt of the solution to like what I said about the meta problem, that it seems because of the predictions of public choice that you're not going to be, that the constitutional political economy is a failed project from the start. His solution is that you need to kind of renew like the liberal spirit or something like that. Right. He explicitly says that this is not compatible with the like really homo economicus, like mechanical view of economics, but he says, well, we should reject that anyway. And I think that's on to something that's in the right direction, but I don't think it's quite strong enough for various reasons. I mean, it seems like positive ideological developments can be co-opted, and also they're necessarily going to be running uphill because, again, while it's not mechanical, there is a really strong tendency internally for state dynamics to go a particular way. I also think it's important that I think the right way to say this, that in institutions, in a world with institutions that libertarianism, anarchism opposes, libertarianism and anarchism will thereby be harder to get yourself to, because ideologically our familiarity with the way certain things are leads us to see them as that's the way that they are done, that they have to be done. So, for example, if all you have ever known in terms of money is exchanging every transaction you're a part of, you use dollars, state-backed currency. Your familiarity with that will make it seem like that is obviously what is necessary for currency. Your familiarity with checking to see it being relevant to you, whether or not something is, for example, like FDA approved, like will lead you to kind of equate like FDA approval with like safety itself. And so then the thought is, well, what if we didn't have the FDA? Seems to be the thought of like, well, what if we didn't have any kind of safety at all with food and drugs and so on and so forth. And so the fact that we live in a world already marked by these kind of perverse institutions thereby makes it harder for us to see a world outside of it. So that's reasons why I don't think just the kind of like rekindling the liberal spirit suggestion for Buchanan is enough all on its own to solve the problem. But I think it's definitely a step in the right direction because, as you say, it's the mechanical view of the mechanical view of economics in general, and certainly public choice can make it seem more unsolvable than it actually is.
Yeah. It seems like to the extent that your public choice model is mechanical, the more the meta problem is going to be apparent, and the more pessimistic it seems like you would have reason to be. But you're saying even with the less mechanical version, and with a healthy role for ideology in the model, it's still not enough. So then what? You talk a little bit about the paper about what you think maybe an alternative viable path would be that appropriately takes into consideration public choice insights, even more so than the public choice economists that you've been mentioning did.
Yeah. So I think the problem is the what creates the meta problem is an assumption that politics is about engagement with state institutions. That either it's reform, you're trying to get the state to change its own policies, or it's even like something like more dramatic, like a revolution. You're trying to change from one state structure to another. In any event, you are trying to first get the state to change something about itself, and then through things like voting, lobbying, running elections, so on and so forth, you're still trying to work through the machine. And if you're trying to work through the machine, you're going to run into its internal, the way that machine works, which again, varies over a strong tendency towards things that have concentrated benefits, dispersed costs, things that will tend to enrich the already powerful, so on and so forth. And if that's the case, then the way to get out of this kind of meta problem is to step back and see, is there a way to change something about the machine without trying to go through the machine? And that's basically the idea that I kind of sketch out towards the end. And I don't go into great detail, of course, but basically, I think this is a good reason to go in the direction that a lot of anarchists do, which is something about direct action, trying to look at ways of making political change that doesn't require going through the state to begin with. So things like, so whether or not it'll actually work in the end, I think that the right kind of model is the kind of thing that the very politically motivated people and interested in cryptocurrency, especially Bitcoin, are interested in, which is you try to just build the alternative that you want to see, and without relying on the state to adjust its own policies. You're not trying to get the state to liberalize on legal currency laws. First, you just try and get the thing running off the ground to begin with. That kind of a thing, basically adjusting to these things outside of the state.
Well, aren't you a little worried maybe that looking at the historical track record, perhaps? I mean, there's been, I think, on the margin, some substantial movements in the right direction, or liberalization, as you said, and at least in our sense of the term, using the state, at least on the margin, or some, maybe not the entire state, right, but some local government, some department, some avenue of that. If we turn away from that strategy completely, is there losses there? Are you worried that on the margin, this other strategy of purely direct action would really be able to make the sorts of gains that we'd want?
Yeah. So I don't think that there is never any role ever for people to try to go through like state mediated politics. I don't think that it has always been just a long, slow slog of things getting worse in every dimension. So, for example, obviously the abolition of slavery is a monumental instance of positive progress, and also the civil rights, etc., abolishing Jim Crow, those sorts of things, obvious improvements. The fact that we don't have a draft anymore, obvious improvement. However, it seems like so this is something I want to think more about, which is, it seems like a lot of the progress that we do have tends to be along the lines of what we might take to be like very strictly construed social liberty. Now, I've written before, like, I don't think that the social liberty, economic liberty divide is really like totally coherent, but there's sorts of things that we can generally lump into one or the other. And it seems like there's something about the kind of obvious social extensions of egalitarian extensions of liberty that makes it so that the moral tide is so overwhelming at a certain point that those things change. But at the same time, things that are a little bit less straightforwardly read off of just like equal concern for people, that's where you see a lot of the more negative change. So a greater and greater centralization of the state, just greater and greater surveillance, things like that, things that are not directly tied to equal concern for other people in a very obvious way, like slavery, etc. Those seem to be the areas where things tend to get worse, certainly a lot of economic issues. So I would want to say, just getting back to your question, again, I don't want to begrudge people of politics that engages the state in some way that obviously has some gains. I just think that people tend to almost conflate politics with politics that engages the state. It's an overwhelming focus, even among people who are very hostile to the state, to engage through the state. And I think people should be doing a lot more of the direct action.
Right. So even if it's not totalizing, advice, trying to shift on the margin in the direction of efforts, perhaps, or at least the way people think about where they direct their efforts. It also seems to me that, I don't know, I'm curious what you'd say. A lot of these successes that you point out that were ultimately moved along electorally, I mean, they were precipitated by non-electoral efforts and things that you would count as direct action in the case of slavery, in the case of civil rights, in the case of the draft, tons of evasiveness. Go ahead.
I mean, the Underground Railroad is probably one of the most famous instances of direct action in American history, easily.
Yeah. It's I mean, it doesn't have to be either or. It seems like perhaps it takes an amount of direct action and sort of cultural change, and then almost tipped over completely by some final electoral nail in the coffin in these cases, I suppose. Well, I have one more question on these public choice related issues before maybe pivoting, and that is it's strange and unfortunate to me that it seems like public choice gets kind of a bad rap in certain circles, and it's just it seems like there's lots of areas that are ripe for overlap. I mean, earlier when you were describing the public choice view at the very beginning of the show, it almost seems like that. Especially the more mechanical version. I mean, it almost overlaps with Marxism and with this kind of like materialistic view of history, to where we're responding to economic incentives and for the most part, or in the long run, if not entirely, at the end of the day. And so, and obviously you hedged against that more mechanical view. There's like a version of public choice and a version of Marxism that are both kind of like vulgar and more mechanical, and maybe like a softer, more reasonable version of each. But anyway, why do you think of the bad rap? What do you think maybe has people looking suspiciously at the invocation of public choice, despite potential areas of overlap? And then what do you think, if anything, could be done about that? Maybe to like certain ways to apply public choice or talk about it in a way that it gets out of its academic bubble and maybe like other groups take it more seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think. By the way, for what it's worth, on the Marx comment, Michael Munger actually has an interesting article on similarities of Karl Marx and as like a precursor to public choice in some respects. Obviously, the biggest difference is that public choice is really insistent on thinking about kind of the individual's incentives, that it's thinking less in terms of, well, someone is of the particular class, therefore they have particular interests, and trying to get more fine-grained about the particular interest that a person in their very particular position to the institutions would be. Also, I think more skepticism about certain kinds of institutions like the state as such, rather than the state as class instrument. That there's some respect, I would say, that someone even more similar than Marx would be Bakunin and his critique of Marx, where he suggests that once people are in control of the state, then they kind of cease to have the kind of like class interests that Marx suggests, and that seems like a similar kind of more public choicey perspective. But anyway, I think the obvious reason why public choice is something that more people on the left, more radical inclined people tend to be less interested in is it has kind of political associations with the right. So James Buchanan, I wouldn't say he was a conservative. He was definitely a libertarian, classical liberal, but he wasn't totally averse to friendliness with American conservatives, even though he was not himself conservative. And general association with the right, I think, is hesitancy for that with radicals. I think one way to look at it, so Radley Balko, I remember, had a really good article in the Washington Post several in like 2017 or so on public. Here I have it. It's public choice theory is crucial to understanding the criminal justice system. So I would highly recommend that to people. It's basically just outlining how public choice can help us to see the way that things like the incentives of police unions, the incentives of prosecutors who are wanting to win elections again, the incentives of the way that things like the structure of how the census counts people in prison. Those sorts of things are things that helped us to explain why mass incarceration is so extensive in the United States and why police are so unaccountable, et cetera, et cetera. And those are public choice insights that help us to see that. So I would just recommend that people look at the way that public choice is used to think about issues that they care about, like mass incarceration, police brutality, etc., and see like how useful of a tool that it really is. That's what I would recommend.
You recently published a book chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Libertarianism. People should perhaps contact you if they'd like to read it.
Yeah, on any of this, for what it's worth.
On any of it, okay.
People should feel free to reach out.
Yes, definitely encourage people to. So to read the actual stuff that we're kind of talking about. So the book chapter for the Libertarianism Handbook is on reparations. And so that's extremely interesting to me. I'm glad they got in a chapter on reparations, I feel like 10 years ago or any time before. A handbook on libertarianism maybe wouldn't have included that necessarily, or maybe not as quickly. Could you, I'm curious if you could share with our audience what you take to be the bad arguments for reparations, and then maybe if there are any good arguments for reparations, or vice versa.
Yeah. So, I guess the bad arguments, one of the bad arguments that I don't like as much. So I won't go through all of them. I do have another podcast where I talk about this quite a bit with
that's with Alex Aragona.
Yeah, Curious Task. Yeah, with Alex Aragona.
Yeah, it was good.
So anyone who's interested in this should also feel free to listen to that later. But one of the arguments that I don't like as much is the unjust enrichment argument, which basically says that if someone is unjustly enriched at someone else's expense, then the proceeds of that unjust enrichment should go to the person who it was at their expense. And the reason I don't like that is I think that among other issues, it assumes that slavery is actually a particularly productive economic force. The kind of analysis that I prefer is one that says that slavery actually is economically destructive. It tends to make everyone on the long term, just about everyone, worse off. It just obviously makes directly enslaved people a whole lot worse off. And while it might relatively privilege, it certainly does relatively privilege several people. And even down the road, it will relatively privilege, for example, white Americans generally, that we had a system of slavery. But nonetheless, even we're thinking in absolute terms rather than relative terms. I think there is a very good case to be made that the United States in general would be much wealthier, that everyone, including white Americans, would be significantly wealthier in absolute terms now than they would have been. Than we would be richer if we had not had slavery than we are now. That slavery is something that is a hindrance on the economy. Now, and so obviously if that's the case, then the unjust enrichment argument has problems because it seems to be assuming an absolute enrichment that I think is just questionable. Now, as for the kind of argument that I like more, the gist would be this. So obviously, someone who is enslaved, they themselves deserve a reparations. I think everyone agrees on that now. But the thing that people will charge against reparations is, but someone alive today wasn't enslaved, or I didn't have anything to do with slavery, so I shouldn't be paying for reparations. Of course, through taxation. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it on two fronts. So one, it's not that the person living today is entitled to reparations directly in the sense of, for being enslaved. Obviously they weren't enslaved, but what is true is that their ancestor was entitled to reparations, which were never paid. And I think we can plausibly say that debt is passed down. And since they didn't have the debt in their possession and they weren't able to actually will it, we have to assume the line of inheritance. And so through a line of inheritance, the debt that was originally something that their ancestor was entitled to is now theirs. And so that gets that half of it. The other half of it is, rather than looking at taxpayers and their liability, thinking of it as a surviving institutional culprit, namely the state. So the extent to which the state is involved in slavery. So the state obviously maintained slavery. The state obviously had all sorts of other laws for the purpose of maintaining slavery, kept people enslaved, so on and so forth. So the state owes reparations, and the state, and in the same way that, for example, if Walmart wronged someone, if Walmart like destroyed someone's house or something against the law, and then all the boards of directors, etc., were changed with Walmart, you could still sue Walmart. It's the same thing, an institutional culprit that can be sued. And then so the state owes reparations. Then there is a fair question, about taxation. But I don't think there's a unique problem here with taxation, in that it's not as though taxation that ends up going to reparations is uniquely unjust. It's rather that taxation is unjust in general, right? Taxation, it's unjust to forcibly take money from people, etc. But to the extent that the state has money to begin with, it is required to say, like, if you have money and you owe the money to someone else, you're required to give that money to that person you owe it to. So to the extent that the state has money, it is already obligated to pass on that money to people who are owed reparations. It's true that it's unjust to make ordinary people in the United States to tax them for the purpose of reparations, but it's not unique to reparations. I mean, taxation in general is unjust. There's nothing unique about reparations that would make the taxation unjust. So, if anything, at least there's a certain sense in which even an anarchist can say that paying reparations is a legitimate function of government, because insofar as the government is an institution that has debts, it ought to pay those debts. And so a legitimate use of its money is to spend that money giving it back to its victims. And so that's what reparations is doing. It's the same principle as suing a police department after false arrest or something like that. It's exactly the same sort of question. And insofar as we don't throw up our hands and say, well, you should never sue the police department for false arrest because that money comes from taxes. The same principle applies with reparations, that, sure, in principle, we shouldn't have taxation, so on and so forth. But the state already has money. And if the state already has money, then that money ought to go to pay to the debts of the people that it has wronged. That's the long and short of the argument.
I guess a lot of libertarians and anarchists would say, in some sense, there is no state. The state is just a group of people. The state is a collection of individuals. So I guess I'm curious, getting into the weeds of this justification for reparations. With the state as an entity owing it, but okay, well, the state, if everything the state has it got from other people. I mean, you've already sort of touched on this, and it's interesting. Are you saying does maybe just requires biting the bullet? Because in the case of suing a police department for false arrest, that seems really weird for a libertarian or anarchist to, like you said, throw up our hands and say, well, that you can't do that. That's immoral. That would be strange. But in that case, I guess it seems a little more obvious that, perhaps what would be obviously just would be that the police officer themselves owes the debt of restitution or reparations or something to make whole their victim. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't seem like that is, there's an obvious analogous entity for that in the reparations case. So how would you, how do you think about it like that? And how would you respond to people who say, like, they may be uncomfortable with throwing up their hands in the false arrest case, but still not everything's fitting together the way it should, maybe?
Yeah, I guess I would say that that collective entities like the state or Walmart or any other business or like a church or whatever, that those can be separately liable in particular sense, which is that that they have a certain kind of decision procedure which is followed, and if that decision procedure is followed, then by the relevantly authorized people, then I think we can accurately say that is that institution acting in a very particular sense. And the extent to which that institution is responsible for something, then is a sense in which that institution can be sued. So if Walmart bulldozes someone's house, but all the people who were involved in that decision are just suddenly up and die for some unrelated reason. But it was within the normal decision procedures of Walmart, et cetera, it seems to me that Walmart as a company is in some sense responsible and can thereby be legitimately sued. And I would have that same kind of principle apply here.
Okay. Well, that's interesting.
That does get to a crux of some different arguments, to be clear. But that is the way that I would get to it.
I guess if you're thinking that taxation itself is unjust, though, would it be, the particular individuals who owe their own, who make up the state, who owe the debt now? Or why does it become?
Yeah. So here's what I would say. Go
ahead.
So what I say in the chapter is, so I say some ways that someone who's not an anarchist would go, but I'll skip that here.
Yeah. That's where it becomes interesting.
Exactly. And basically what I would just say is the state owes a set of debts that it is just impossible to pay. The state is, if the state paid all of its debts, it's impossible because everything that it has is thereby stolen, basically, just about. But that doesn't mean we don't have to look at the question as, does the state pay off all of its debts at once? That's not the question we're generally faced with. The question is, does the state pay off any of the debt that is owed to anyone that it has ever wronged? So we don't ask, again, in the suing the police department case, if the state paid off all of the times that it's wronged somebody, it would be impossible. No, we say, well, we're able to get that restitution in this case, and so we should get it. So in principle, it's impossible for the state to pay all the reparations that it owes. But when we're able to get the reparations that the state owes, it seems perfectly fine to do that, knowing that this is an opportunity that we have, and we don't have the opportunity for all these other things. I do think, nonetheless, though, a kind of critique that I would be more sympathetic to is to say the fact that the state is never going to be able to pay off debts for all of its wrongdoing is reason to not see reparations as just the solution for anything in particular, because obviously the sheer scope of reparations is impossible to pay, but rather this is reason to, when we can get reparations, to go for those, but in general be just trying to reduce the power of the state. But I think people are nonetheless entitled to reparations if when they can be gotten.
Well, in terms of where the individuals who make up the state get the resources with which to pay the state's debts, as far as that goes, though, I think a lot of libertarians feel unsatisfied there. It almost feels like you said, okay, we should get reparations where we can get them, restitution where we can get it. That does make sense. But almost in the abstract, I suppose, if you were thinking about the most appropriate receivers of reparations or restitutions for the state's offenses that it owes debts for, wouldn't the first just be the living taxpayers? That okay, you can say, it looks like we're in a situation where that's not going to happen, and the state has the money. Then we're faced with the question of how it uses that money. Okay, I'm on board there. Restitution and reparations makes a lot of sense. I almost feel like a lot of libertarians are resistant because they feel like, nevertheless, in the abstract, that ideally, the most appropriate receiver of the money would just be the living victims, say, of the state's theft. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I think, one, that's not a reason to not pay reparations if we can get reparations. Because, again, the fact that suppose it would be more important to get one set of reparations than another set of reparations, but the more important one is not really a live option. But the second one is in fact owed, is in fact entitled to the people who would receive them. Seems like a really weird argument to say the fact that even more pressing would be this first set is a reason to not do the one that we can get. And so first of all, I don't think it works as an argument against reparations. Second, I think there's a lot of different considerations that go into like which reparations should take precedence. I do think that recency of time, the fact that the actual direct victims are still alive, those are relevant. I think another relevant consideration is the sheer extent, the sheer seriousness of the injustice with slavery, which is much stronger than ordinary taxation. I think also the fact that the distributional effects that resulted from slavery are still having impact today. That's a relevant consideration. Notice that while the distributional questions are not a reason to tax or redistribute to begin with, that doesn't mean that it's not a reason to prioritize handing back restitution that is in fact owed. That if you, for example, there were two people who were wronged in a car accident and one of them is significantly poorer than the other one, it does seem like it's like a reasonable thing to prioritize that person receiving their restitution quicker than the other person. So I think there are good, like present looking reasons for preferring reparations for slavery. Doesn't mean that there's not good reasons in the other direction. There are, but nonetheless, I think the right answer is just whatever we can get reparations for now. And by the way, Chris Fryman and Jessica Flanagan on this topic of reparations now also point to another thing that plausibly is a current injustice that people are owed reparations for, which is the drug war. So they have a paper on that I would highly recommend to people. It's not unique to slavery. I mean, all sorts of like state aggression is obviously extremely pervasive.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, and maybe this feels like more of like an interesting thought experiment type line of thought, but I'm curious nevertheless because of what we're talking about. Suppose you could just in the abstract create a list. Like, what would you do first then? Like, my mind goes, I mean, slavery is up there because you said the intensity and the pervasiveness and the awfulness of it. But I think you also have a lot of foreign policy people around the world that would probably be entitled, descendants perhaps, or people surrounding victims of the nuclear bombings, perhaps, or fire bombings in Germany and Tokyo.
Yeah, so this is not really a question I've given thought to, because again, it just
it's not really relevant,
but
yeah,
it is. Yeah,
but you give a lot of thought to questions that aren't practical. So
just off the cuff, I think I would agree with you about anyone who's anyone whose loved one is anyone whose connection, whatever, is actually killed by the state would be the first priority. And that would very much include a lot of what you were talking about there. And then I would probably go for living incarcerated, people who've been incarcerated second, and then probably like slavery, like type stuff after that. And then down the line, I mean, I think an interesting question is stuff like Jim Crow laws. Like it's interesting in that, because so with slavery, you can point to this person was enslaved. Like there's a particular thing that was done to this person at this time. But stuff like Jim Crow, that's more like structuring the society, and it's not like this like you can point to this person was prevented at this exact time from going into this store or whatever, but rather just kind of like a lingering, just general worsening of a certain set of persons' lives by force. So I would put that high up there, but I think it's a lot harder question to like calculate exactly what we're even like thinking about with the reparations there, because you don't have the discrete actions like you do with slavery or killing or incarcerating someone.
Well, if the question is, reparations, when we can get them for any of these things, what do you think of the line of thought then that virtually all the money, all the resources that the state gives out to virtually anyone besides the incredibly rich, why don't those things count as reparations for like the entirety of state capitalism and like the litany of like regulations and expropriations and subsidies and everything that like makes everyone poor in general, which I take you to agree with. So then why isn't just like tons of the state spending just, well, that's reparations we can get for living people who would otherwise be wealthier without the state?
Yeah. So I guess on that point, my main objections would be kind of twofold, which is one, like long running ongoing programs do seem to be tied to increasing the amount that the state is taking from people in a more like tight knit way. And then, so that's like a reason to be wary of that line.
Right.
But even more than that, I think I would just not think it's like the right kind of strategy for dealing with the state's injustices, to just try to like have the state pump out as much money for the injustices it's committed, because by its nature it commits those sorts of injustices. So insofar as we integrate the state further and further into our lives, we're going to have more of those exact kind of injustices. So
you think
it's like pumping out as many Band-Aids as possible, instead of like shutting off the machine that is like cutting
us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It seems more important to cut off the machine or slow down the machine at least. And if whatever the process is that is pumping out the Band-Aids, if speeding that up is going to speed up the cutting machine, then you obviously, then that's a reason to not go for, to not be as concerned in the immediate term with the Band-Aids. This is a very strange metaphor that I've landed on. But, I think that's the gist of what I would say there is I think it's the wrong orientation to have towards the state. It's forgetting the first premise of its argument, which is that the state by its nature just is pervasively something that will, to the extent that it grows, keep seriously wronging people.
So do you think that, are you saying that these uses of the state's resources, taking them can perhaps be justified, but like the entire project of this like ongoing thing is too bound up with, say, the injustice of taxation and other injustices and imprisonment and all this stuff to be, so it makes it like unpragmatic in the long run, even though.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the thought is I don't think there's anything unjust in principle with, I mean, even if there wasn't an issue of reparations, like there's nothing unjust about giving money to poor people, right? So the state giving money to a poor person is not, that's not an injustice. The injustice is the background taxation that got us to that point.
But I'm saying though, I just want to interrupt quick, just briefly to say that I think that it's much easier when we're just looking at the very poor people. But I mean to say that virtually everyone except for the super rich, I mean like middle class farmers.
I see. That's a good.
Are they okay? Is that just of them to take and say, take their subsidies? This seems a weird place. So I don't know where the argument takes us. There's so many interesting kind of factors at play.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I guess. I think that kind of a thing I would say is like much more geared towards, there's like active distortions in the economy that creates and so on in a way that makes those things bad in all sorts of other ways. And they're bound up with taxation. But yeah, in that case, I mean, again, strictly speaking, there's nothing wrong with giving money to farmers. Just if you put it that way. Even before you get to the way you've tinged it with the reparations point, which adds further problem, obviously, but those are bad for all sorts of other reasons. It is bad because it distorts the economy, because it creates a certain kind of a set of interests that will want to maintain dysfunctional economic policies, will create certain kind of interests that will want to maintain state power in these regards, so on and so forth, bound up with taxation, so on and so forth. But yeah, that's more or less what I would say. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, I think people, this kind of leads into one of my last questions regarding the issue of reparations, and that is a lot of people, I think, have similar worries, though, with slavery reparations in terms of, we have this just situation in the abstract, but in practice, and this really connects up to the public choice issues we were discussing. How do you square the circle with, we have these public choice concerns, and in that world, reparations perhaps won't go to who in the abstract is actually owed money, but perhaps to other people who are able to rent, seek, or capture the state in some way.
Yeah, no. So that's what I was saying. I think earlier I said something about a certain kind of critique that I was more sympathetic to, and I think this is the one that I had in mind. I think obviously it depends a lot on what the reparations program we have in mind is. I think a lump sum restitution is pretty hard to game. So I think that one is I think that's a reason for favoring that as opposed to a lot of other like kind of restructuring type programs that couldn't that kind of like create more opportunities for various actors to take advantage of and to have this like more persistent issue of the kind that we're thinking of with these other programs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just the last bit on reparations. I'm curious. The context of this essay of yours was in the Routledge Handbook of Libertarianism. What can you say about that relationship in particular? I mean, libertarians, I would say most of them, fairly dismissive of reparations, in my experience, for the reasons we've discussed. But but then it also seems like you think there's a pretty clear case too to get from libertarianism to some kind of reparations. So what do you think about historically why libertarians maybe haven't done the issue justice?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different things. So one, it's not 100% true because there are plenty of libertarians who have been more favorable to reparations, like Murray Rothbard most of the time, and the one exception I know of is the one you pointed me to, actually.
Yes.
And then Walter Block also even, and a handful of other like Rothbardians tend to be very favorable to reparations. But I think and also like one of my advisors at Georgia State when I was doing my master's, Andrew I. Cohen, has written a fair bit in favor of reparations. It's a different argument than the one I've given here, but I think it's worthwhile and good. But here's what I would say it's kind of a threefold thing, which is one, I think the issue of taxation, just the fact that it's being it is a government using tax money to redistribute in a certain sense. It's not really redistribution in the same way, but it is nonetheless at least has an appearance of redistribution. Two, I do think that just in general, a lot of reparations discourse is really just like across the board bad. People getting like bogged down in questions about whatever extent that like currently living white people are responsible for slavery, right. And that has no bearing as far as I can tell on the question, because like for the reasons I was giving earlier, and stuff about like the extent to which the United States is enriched by slavery. Again, that's, I don't think, a good argument. Just a lot of things that are like particular to the way that the reparations debate has gone, I think. And then the third thing would be, I think a major part of it is also like the fact that libertarians, the long running effects of like fusionism, basically, that conservatives obviously have reasons to be averse to reparations, and to the extent that's true, then libertarians who see themselves in political alliance with conservatives are more likely to see like the salience of the arguments against reparations and thereby go for those. I mean, just any kind of like you tend to think the arguments that your friends like are better than the ones that your friends don't like. And if you are in political alliance with conservatives, you're more likely to see the anti-reparations arguments as better. So that's the three reasons I would give for why libertarians have often been averse to reparations.
So moving away from that, the last thing I want to talk about with you is a paper, another forthcoming book chapter, as far as I know, of yours about war. War and Methodological Individualism. Now, I thought this was a really fascinating paper. I really quite enjoyed all three, but this one might have been the most thought provoking for me personally. I don't know. Maybe you can just tell our audience what you had in mind with this paper, where conventional approaches to understanding the morality of war go wrong. Even libertarians, I thought your paper included a powerful critique of even Rothbard on the way he thought about war and how he was insufficiently methodologically individualist in looking at the situation. So could you explain that a little bit, that issue?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in that paper, and as you know, and so I'm afraid that if I just try to give a general overview that I'll talk for 30 minutes. So I'll just try and one point that I think is especially important related to what you were just saying.
Yeah, go ahead.
Which is, I think that there's a common way that we like find ourselves talking about war, like the United States going to war with Iraq, or the United States attacking Iraq, as if the United States is one like person who is attacking one other person, like as if like George W. Bush is personally going over and like punching Saddam Hussein. And when we think about it that way, it's very easy to look like, okay, so what are the reasons for attacking Iraq, like this one individual? And when we look at it that way, I think there's even like the kind of more neocon case is to some degree plausible, that obviously Iraq is what the Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a tyrannical dictatorship. It's one, and obviously you don't have a right to tyrannize your people. And does the United States have standing to stop tyranny? Of course it does. Anybody has standing to stop tyranny. And so that kind of like very like holistic way of looking at it can make a lot of these more hawkish positions a lot more like superficially plausible. But of course, the United States attacking Iraq is not that simple. It's a lot of people who are under the command of other people, who are under the command of still other people, going across the world and dropping bombs, etc., all sorts of violence in strategically speaking towards the aim of stopping a particular set of people in power in this other country, and a lot of people are there in between. That it's not just like George W. Bush personally drops one bomb on the whatever building that Saddam Hussein is in, and then that's the war. It's bombs are dropped repeatedly by a lot of different soldiers who, while they receive the same training, have very different temperaments, very different risk assessments, very different levels of personal concern for the people in the countries that they're attacking, that then results in a lot of violence that falls on a lot of ordinary people all across the war zone. And not just that, but on the issue of the war zone, it's not like it's a single instance of this happening, just a bunch of bombs sweeping through. This area, this geographic area, is now subject to repeated tactical violence, so that it's now just impossible to live in that area realistically. There's a serious restriction on your freedom. These sorts of things that I think get papered over in a lot of discussions of war, where the question is like, what are the basis of this side of the war? What is the basis of this other side of the war? They have a just cause. And that's all well and good, except that we have to remember that we're thinking of a lot of individual instances of violence repeated across time by a lot of different people. And while it may well be true, for example, that in principle, overthrowing Saddam Hussein is a legitimate reason for using violence against Saddam Hussein. It's not a legitimate reason to do like what happened at Abu Ghraib, for example. But if you are embarking on the project of war, you know that you are risking that. So I think there's a lot of like kind of idealization that goes on in questions about war, and that's kind of what I was trying to disentangle there.
Well, isn't it like a lot of other things like reparations? There's better and worse versions of it. There's the ideal version that we can come up with in our heads, and there's the messier, practical version. I don't know, why can't people say, maybe they're saying too, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater with being anti-war because of certain aspects of it that I think everyone would agree those aspects, or not everyone, but assume, some class of people that, okay, well, that what you're talking about is unjust, but these other aspects of the war taken to undergo XYZ goals were just. What do you say to people who maybe, is that them being nuanced, or is that them like being too idealistic?
So I think nothing I say in that article says war is by necessity always 100% wrong. However, I do think that the standards are so high, they're significantly higher than I think just about anybody thinks that they are. So, for example,
okay.
Rothbard is favorable to wars that are fought to stave off that are either fought to stave off an attacker or fought to for independence or revolution, so on and so forth. But yeah, sure. Again, that's there's a question about, is violence justified for this purpose? Maybe so. But is violence justified is a different question from, is war justified? Because war comes along with it, not just violence against the people who would be liable for the violence, in principle. It comes with violence against a lot of innocent people fought in the crosshairs. It comes with opportunities for people to commit atrocities that no one would think could justified. For, again, things like the Abu Ghraib situation, which it's not. So the way that people usually think about that is, yeah, so this war may or not be just, but then there's a lot of unjust stuff that happens within the war. But if you look throughout history, just the regularity of those kinds of incidents of people committing atrocities, I think the decision to go to war has to be also a decision to do something that you know is almost certainly going to result in these sorts of things that you consider to be atrocities. It can't just be, oh, well, this is justified, and then if the atrocity happens, that's bad, but that doesn't really speak against the initial justification. I think having the initial justification and the atrocity that kind of conceptually separated is an illusion, because at the time of embarking on the war, that is a known probability that something like that is going to happen. That, I guess that's what I would say on that.
Okay. Well, your view seems to be, I know you're not a consequentialist. So how do you avoid then letting this turn into, because I think on one reading it turns into a consequentialist weighing of weighing between the aspects of war that people want to say are justified, and then what you're saying are the predictably and obvious downstream results of embarking on war. So how do you avoid that turning into, looking at these historical cases and saying, well, with the predictable but awful downstream effects do outweigh whatever successes and what lives rescued in some other respect?
Yeah, so I'm not thinking about it as a consequentialist. I don't think you have to be a consequentialist. For example, I mean, like, suppose that you set up, you have a company with like a particularly bad culture of harassment, and for a fact that, so like, say you even have like official company rules that are against that harassment, but you're not really like cracking down on it too much, and you have the company going on having some particular projects that that harassment is more likely to occur. And it seems like if you do that knowing that harassment is more likely to occur, and you're not doing something that meaning you're not really doing something that can be dependably taken to prevent that, seems like you can be held in a certain level of responsibility, not the same kind of responsibility as the person engaged in the harassment, but you are responsible for creating the conditions for knowingly creating conditions where that's likely to occur. And if that's the case, then it seems like in the same respect with the war situation, that you can't really throw up your hands and say, well, I didn't want that to happen. If you know that creating the kind of circumstances that there are in war is going to lead to those kinds of, is almost inevitably going to lead to those kinds of situations, then you are responsible for creating the circumstances that lead to those situations. And that's something you shouldn't do unless you have like a really overabiding reason.
So I guess that's where it gets into what I think a lot of people perceive and maybe don't have a way of thinking about it differently. I don't know what it is with war. It seems like this kind of consequentialist model almost comes naturally or perhaps to people. Is it, how do you get out of, I mean, I guess I'm wondering maybe how action guiding some of this can be. What counts as a really good overriding reason? I mean, it seems like a lot of people in a lot of wars saw something that looked like a really good overriding reason. I know that your answer doesn't involve downplaying the tyrannies and injustices.
Yeah.
Because that's often, I think, is a completely absurd line of argument that people wish was the case and helps them justify their anti-war views. But without doing that, then what do we do? I mean, is the alternative just to throw up our hands and say, okay, then Saddam's dictatorship continues and that's it?
I mean, some saying, yeah. So I think it will always be the case that there is not all, it will very regularly be the case there is some legitimately serious issue in question here. But the fact that interventions are so rarely successful, that they're so rarely successful in terms of being focused on the particular mission, that they dependably create the circumstances that lead to another conflict down the line. It seems like the only way to really get off of that cycle is to just be able to put your foot down and accept that the circumstances in the given case really are horrible, but nonetheless, we need to kind of step off of a general policy of interventionism. You need to adopt a non-interventionism as a policy, and the only way to do that is to reject particular instances of intervention as they come to you.
It's interesting to me that you basically agree with what a lot of paleo libertarians or paleo conservatives would take to be their view, non-interventionism. But yet you, I think, at the same time, disagree with a lot of their framing and the way they think about the issues. So I'm curious if you could unpack that and where you see that they go wrong, and maybe they get to the right conclusion, non-interventionism, but along the way they make other arguments that you don't think work.
Yeah. So a common way of expressing libertarian disagreement with war is to kind of apply like non-aggression to countries. That, well, if this country hasn't attacked us, then we shouldn't attack them. And one thing that more interventionist-friendly people in the libertarian world will sometimes point out, and they'll be right to point out, is that it's fallacious to apply a principle like non-aggression to countries rather than individuals, for similar reasons to what I was saying earlier in the other direction, that Iraq is not just Saddam Hussein. Iraq is a whole bunch of people, and then Saddam Hussein who is tyrannizing them. And in principle, it does not violate non-aggression to use violence to take out Saddam Hussein, because, of course, you could be defending against the aggression that Saddam Hussein is enacting on his own people. However, where I depart from that kind of more interventionist-y line, again, is that I think if you really take seriously the wrongs to individual people, you get back to that very strong, near undefeatable presumption against war. But it's not in terms of national sovereignty. It's not that any country has a given right to rule its own territory without disruption. It's rather that the individuals in that country who are not parts of the government, etc., that they are going to be wronged in virtue of your intervention.
Well, we're talking about war. I'm literally sitting in an armchair. There is actual war going on, of course, in the world. So I feel like, I ought to apply some of this stuff to what's going on. And I want to ask about the war in Ukraine. What do you? Where do you think people are going wrong in the discussions of the war in Ukraine? I would be remiss not to get into the actual live geopolitical issues that are going on and all the debates around war, because I feel like in your model, it feels like a lot of people are talking past each other, and it leads to unproductive disagreements. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on the war in Ukraine, the way people, especially anarchists, talk about the war in Ukraine?
I don't have a lot that is novel to say, I think. I will say, I think a few things that are places where people are too quick is, one, thinking how you don't need to have a particular line about why Putin invaded Ukraine to see the United States in the idea of the United States getting more involved than it is now in the situation as something that would be very bad. It doesn't need to be the case that there was anything remotely okay about Putin's intervention for that to be bad. Also, you don't need to think that even if there is not something super apparent about the problem with an intervention right at this moment, interventions predictably have kind of long-running effects of arming, for example, like creating certain kinds of armed powers, so on and so forth.
Militia groups.
That you're not going to be able to reasonably foresee. So I think people in general need to take a step back and one, acknowledge that Putin's invasion was particularly egregious, that it's nothing to downplay about that, so on and so forth. And at the same time, to not be so confident that just because Putin's invasion is so obviously evil, that thereby there's no problems in responding to it in any given way. And I think also it is worth, this is very much not a popular thing to say, but I think it is very serious to de-escalation in that part of the world is very important, in particular because of the specter of nuclear weapons.
Right.
That we do not want a situation to unfold where nuclear weapons end up getting used, and that's, unfortunately, it's that simple.
Yeah, I've been kind of annoyed. Well, I'm kind of breaking the host rules here, kind of playing.
Go ahead.
Reeling my hand, but yeah, there's almost been like a counter reaction to those worried about nuclear activity, and then the opposite direction, a counter reaction that this, what seems to me like, comically, if it weren't so serious, cavalierness toward nuclear exchange. That's weird. I think. I mean, I've never really seen that. I feel like upon reflection, a lot of the people expressing that view hopefully wouldn't really commit themselves to that. And it's more of a frustration at what feels like apologetics for the invasion itself. Like people view like people invoking the nuclear exchange in bad faith. And it's just as an excuse to ally, blame on a government that they like, apparently the Russian government in some cases, maybe a little bit. So yeah, I agree. It's been frustrating to feel like that does exist. I feel like maybe some of the bad faith invocation, but on the whole, and regardless of its motives, it's obviously a real concern that
I think
it's
a lot
deadly
of people,
serious.
As far as I can tell, I think a lot of people just. So one kind of stupid thing that I realized, like, after like COVID started going, is about myself, is that I think before that I had, like, without even thinking about it, it's not like I had this thought, but it was like kind of like something I realized that I like implicitly thought, is I was like never worried about like pandemics before that. Because in my head, it was like, oh, that's a thing that happens in East Asia. It just like categorically doesn't happen in North America, which obviously there's no reason that has to be the case.
Of course.
And so it was like never something that was like remotely a real worry that I had. And it was never like factored into any decision. I mean, not that I had decisions that were that significant before that, relevant to it, but like in thinking about the future and things that I was worried about or not worried about, it just wasn't part of the calculus. And I feel like a lot of people, nuclear weapons are kind of like that for them. Like, obviously there's Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but those have such a like kind of a uniqueness in history. And that we went through a whole Cold War with no nuclear weapons being used, other than testing, obviously. But and so it just kind of, and we've gone through everything with like North Korea, so on and so forth. still no nuclear weapons used. So I think a lot of people, it's almost like nuclear weapons are just like categorically the thing that was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki
once,
and then will never again. Yeah.
Right.
And like, it's not a real like threat. But I think people need to realize it is a real threat, especially when we're talking about a leader as unhinged and increasingly unhinged as Putin.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of ties back to what we were talking about just at the beginning with, it's interesting the way we seem to foreclose these possibilities almost implicitly, like you said, without even thinking about it, because of what we're familiar with, because of the way things are done, the way we're used to it. How many times in the 2010s was North Korea trending on Twitter because of some bizarre incident? They were doing some test. Trump said something, some sort of flare up. I wrote articles about them, and so it almost feels like maybe we're numb to it, perhaps, and so it's worrying and unfortunate. Well, we've talked for quite a bit here. It's been great having you on the show. You've been my good friend for a long time now. I really enjoyed picking your brain. We could talk about a million topics for a million hours, but our listeners have things to do. So I want to thank you for coming on. Do you have any departing thoughts, or maybe where people can reach you? Anything you want to say?
Just anybody who wants to reach out, they can always, if they are interested in any of the things we talked about, any of the papers we talked about, I feel free to reach out for them. Just email me at Jason Lee Byas, BYAS at c4ss.org, and I'd be very happy to send you the paper.
Great. And you're on Twitter, right? At Jason Lee Byas
I'm on
as
Twitter,
well, in case people still use that decrepit platform, which I do.
Yeah, I'm on x.com as Jason Lee Byas. You can follow me on x.com.
Right. We should end the podcast.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, if everyone, if you want, if you like saying that so much, you're
x.com.
Yeah. Well, if you want to catch up with Jason on x.com, everyone's favorite website, please go ahead and do that. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you want, check us out on x.com at c4ss.org, and of course our website and elsewhere. And stay tuned for podcasts next month with more episodes of Mutual Exchange Radio. Thanks for listening, everyone.